need them to get out of here after I say goodbye to them, because they're kind of, they're messing up our conversation. We're having a final conversation here, and all of a sudden I've got to deal with this whole thing of having children and a wife. This will, of course, raise a lot of questions about the sense of duty. And as Socrates may be a bit hard-hearted, lovers of Socrates will say he's focused and locked in. He knows what he's got to get done. Others will say, well, he's kind of a jerk. This notion of they were evil to you, so you have the right to break the law and escape, he will respond by saying this: then we ought not to retaliate or render evil for evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from the state or from an individual. This is an interesting idea, and he will continue. The law would say, or were you to abide by the sentence of the state? In other words, if the state says this is the law, don't you have an obligation to keep the law, even if you don't agree with the law? We can all think of laws, for example, that we disagree with, that we would like to maybe break, but we're not allowed to break those laws if we wish to be good citizens. Socrates' argument will be, we have to keep the law, obey the state. He then does this really interesting thing in the dialogue, where he begins to speak for the state. Now, this is why we often will say that there's actually three speakers in this dialogue. Crito is just listening now. And Socrates will say, can I please speak for the state? If the state was here right now, the men of Athens who condemn you, what would they say about the argument, you can just walk away? He begins to point out, the state would say, didn't we educate you through your education, your schooling? Didn't we provide for you protection? Didn't we raise you from the time you were a child and now you are an adult? And if all of the answers to those questions are, yeah, you did, then the final question, then don't you have a duty to obey the laws of the state? Even if you disagree with those laws, because the state is your mother, your father, your keeper, your provider. And therefore, you have an obligation. By the way, this is what we call the primacy of state argument. Let's go ahead and put it in our notes now as that. The primacy of state. In other words, it resurrects this question. If you are educated and raised and protected by the state, for example, you as students, some people say that by the time you are a senior in high school, you have had the government spend $1 million on you to educate you over your 12 years of education. Whoa, for each of you. If you have been educated by the state, if you have been protected by the state, by its armed forces and the like, do you have a duty to die for that state? If that state asks you to. This is, of course, the great question of conscription during, for example, the Vietnam era, yes? When you were asked to go and defend your country, even if you didn't agree with the war, do you have a moral obligation to fulfill your duty as a citizen? That's this question of the primacy of state. Now, another way to see this is, and we'll mention it later with John Stuart Mill's great little essay on liberty, which is more important when push comes to pull? Which is more important, the individual rights or the rights of the state? And if you'll think about it, of course, always there is this ongoing debate, right, about which is most important, the state and the rights of the state or the individual. Well, we'll continue by looking at a few more of these lines for Socrates that are kind of important things that he would say. And because we think right to destroy you, do you think that you have any right to destroy us in return, and your country, as far as it in you lies? And when we are punished by the state, whether with imprisonment or stripes, the punishment is to be endured in silence. And if she leads us, the state, to wounds or death in battle, thither we follow as is right. The argument being, if you are going to live in a state, then you have a moral duty to defend and even die for that state, whether you agree with the positions of the state or not. Endure with silence? We immediately want to jot down at 3A already, don't we? Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from a Birmingham jail, where he will, of course, address those ministers who are speaking against his cause for civil rights, and he will say, I have a moral duty to speak against the immoral laws and actions of the state, not to acquiesce or to go along. He continues by saying, but he who has experience of the manner in which we order justice and administer the state and still remains, has entered into an implied contract that he will do as we, the state, command him. This is, of course, the social contract question of Rousseau's famous social contract. The idea being that there is an inherent relationship between the individual and the state. And individuals will agree that the state has the power over the individual by virtue of what it is that the state provides. You can already see, though, that there's a thorny bit of questioning that goes on. Well, yeah, I totally agree with that. The state and I have a relationship, a contract. But what happens when the state asks me to do something that is morally reprehensible to me? Now what do I do? Do I follow my own conscience, or do I follow the state? We immediately think of Henry David Thoreau's civil disobedience, don't we? No, I won't pay taxes to a government that believes in slavery or in the war down in Mexico. No, I won't do that. So in other words, you only pay taxes when you agree with what the state is doing, but we are a complex group of people, and we all have our own opinions about right and wrong. The state has to decide, or does it? You can kind of already see the difficulty here. He even goes so far as to argue, he who is a corrupter of the laws is more than likely to be corrupter of the young and foolish portion of mankind. In other words, he says, if I follow you out this door, am I breaking the law? And Crito does one of these numbers like, yes. And if I break the law, then we are saying that my accusers were actually right about me. I am a corrupter of the youth. Am I not right about this, Crito? And Crito will be like, yes. Well, then what is one to do? A very thorny, philosophic, difficult question. Listen then, Socrates, to us. He's again still speaking as the same. Who have brought you up. Think not of life and children first, and of justice afterwards, but of justice first, that you may be justified before the princes of the world below. For neither will you nor any that belong to you be happier or holier or juster in this life, or happier in another, if you do as Crito bids. It's, for just a moment, let's point out, it's kind of ironic that Socrates will go to happy. He'll go to Scooby Snacks. He will say, you cannot look at your life and be happy about it if you, in the final moments, walk out of this jail. The state has condemned you. You must honor the wishes of the state, even though you are innocent and even though you don't agree. Because if you walk out of here and escape, you'll forever have to live with the reality that you broke the law, and that will make you unhappy in the final moments of your life. In other words, you will live the rest of your life regretting this decision. Now you depart in innocence, just to finish. A sufferer and not a doer of evil, a victim not of the laws but of men. But if you go forth returning evil for evil and injury for injury, breaking the covenants and agreements with which you made with us, and wronging those whom you ought least to wrong, that is to say yourself, your friends, your country, and us, we shall be angry with you while you live, and our brethren, the laws in the world below, will receive you as an enemy, for they will know that you have done your best to destroy us. Listen then to us, and not to Crito. Socrates finishes. This is the voice which I seem to hear murmuring in my ears, like the sound of the flute in the ears of the mystic. That voice, I say, is humming in my ears. Of course, we think immediately, don't we, of the little green cricket of Pinocchio. The conscience. He says, this is what my conscience is telling me to do, and I have to honor my conscience. And I know that anything more which you will say will be vain. Yet speak if you have anything to say. To which Crito, the final lines of the dialogue, I have nothing to say, Socrates. Then let me follow the intimations of the will of God. In other words, for Socrates, a believer in the gods, even though he's condemned as an atheist, the gods have given us the state. The state has given us the laws. The laws must be followed. I was condemned by a court. I must follow the laws. No escape. Well, let's take a look now at level 2A really quickly as we finish our conversation at the possible messages, themes of a dialogue like this. Of course, I'm sure some of this you've already got written down already. Let's list several. 1. A citizen is what or who? One who obeys the laws? But what if the laws are wrong, morally wrong? We think, of course, of the slavery issues, don't we? We think, of course, of the great classic text Antigone. How about this one? The suggestion that you have to have the courage to live your life and live your code and live your philosophy all the way to the end of your life. You don't get to, at the very end, make decisions somehow that go counter to your life's code, your life's philosophy. Think about how this text, and we'll mention it at 3A, plays the game, for example, of Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. Yes? Do I, in the moment of greatest conflict, stand up and live my morals as I understand them? Or do I turn and run and then have to live with that? Maybe Crane knew this text. And of course he did. Well, the idea of social contract we might want to write down. The idea of, if you were to write on your paper the word state or government, and then right next to it, with a space in between, write individual or citizen, which sign would you use out of your mathematics? Which way would you draw greater than, lesser than? Which is more important? All of us or one of us? The state or each individual citizen? And what happens when there's friction between those two things? And how do we understand that? Of course, we can also point out that there are a few problems with this dialogue as it relates to apology. For example, in apology, the state was asking Socrates to stop teaching. Funny thing, all of a sudden there he was like, yeah, no, I got to keep teaching because that's part of my involvement in the state, right? Of course, the difference here is that to escape in Crito will be sneaky, and Socrates just can't abide that kind of activity. Of course, we could ask, is there some kind of death wish here? Just like theologians of Christianity have always asked, when Christ walks into Jerusalem riding on his donkey, does he know he's ultimately going to get jacked? Does he have a death wish as well? Of course, we can play that game of comparisons. Finally, at 2B. Note the power of the dialogue. This is dramatic. We're expected to kind of watch and listen and take into consideration these two different diametrically opposed positions. Socrates will speak as and for the state. That's kind of a really interesting way to study the dialogue. And of course, the Socratic use of questions we've already pointed out. At 3A, we've already mentioned it. I will start our list, and you obviously can conclude it on your own. Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, Gandhi's autobiography, and his classic, of course, fight with the British state. Antigone, Sophocles' great play, raises this question. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, a classic text that, of course, you'll enjoy studying. Rousseau's Social Contract, we've already mentioned. MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail. Of course, the question of Christ when asked to render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God the things that are God, brings back this same kind of dialectic debate. Finally, at 3B. Think about a time you were falsely accused. The question, obviously, is do you give in or do you fight? And how do you fight? And you'll remember that MLK said oppressed people respond to oppression in three characteristic ways. One is acquiescence. That's just giving in. He says that can't work because the one who is oppressing you will begin to think that you deserve it. But you can't come back with corrosive hatred. Remember, he said an eye for an eye, quoting Gandhi, leaves the whole world blind. Rather, he said that Hegelian synthesis between those two alternate points was non-violent resistance, the ability to fight but do it in a respectful fashion. Of course, we can't always worry about the majority and what the majority thinks, Socrates argues. What are your thoughts on that? Sometimes you have to stand up against the majority. Finally, this is the dialogue that precedes Phaedo. Socrates' final words. If this is what he says, no, I'm not going to escape, I wonder what he's going to say when he's just a few minutes away from drinking the hemlock. The poison will be there in a cup sitting on a table. And the entire dialogue of Phaedo will be constructed with that cup sitting there the entire time. And everybody in the room knows that as soon as Socrates is finished, he will get up, walk over, and drink the poison to take his own life. He will be executed by the state. What does he have to say right before he goes bye-bye? That makes Phaedo one of Plato's most classic dialogues. Why? Because he will make the argument for the soul. The soul? Yes. That's what makes Phaedo such a compelling dialogue. I hope you'll come back to join us. Thank you.